Like it or not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is the most important person who has ever lived. It's October of 1945, and the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, has a meeting with a man called Robert Oppenheimer. The horrors of the Second World War are now in the past. Nazi Germany has been decimated by the Soviets. Mussolini was thrown out by the Italians, and the Japanese resistance has been crushed by the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Oppenheimer was the man behind the bomb. Just a couple of months earlier, he was at his highest, soaking in the applause he received after a successful bomb test. Now, as he sat with the president, he felt the blood on his hands. However, Truman was not as sympathetic. He reportedly said, "I don't want to see the son of a in office again." How did we get here? How did Oppenheimer become the most important physicist, maybe the most important person ever? Let's go back to the beginning. For a long time, no one believed in nuclear fission. The genius Albert Einstein himself claimed that there was no way to derive nuclear energy. He elaborated that an atom could not be shattered at will. Enter Otto Hahn, who discovered nuclear fission in 1938. Fission is basically the process of splitting of nuclei of an atom. Radioactive elements are used for this. A chain of such reactions eventually leads to a massive explosion. Otto Hahn achieved this tremendous feat by bombarding the uranium atom with neutrons. His German origins meant that it was a very real possibility that the manic Adolf Hitler and the Nazis could have a bomb in a few years. After fleeing Nazi Germany, Einstein encouraged President Roosevelt to develop a program for a bomb, and so came into being the Manhattan Project in 1942. Nuclear facilities were constructed in Tennessee and New Mexico. The plutonium for the bombs was obtained from the nuclear production facility in Hanford, Washington. But, most importantly, 38-year-old Robert Oppenheimer was appointed as a director of the laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. This was a curious choice, as he was not a Nobel Prize laureate like many of his compatriots, and he had no prior experience of leading such a project. However, the director of the project, Leslie Groves, was impressed by Oppenheimer's confidence and intelligence. The final device that many scientists chose was a compact explosive made of fissile material. Oppenheimer learned to manage the scientists very quickly. He became the leader of the small community of scientists that developed at Los Alamos. His fellow scientists loved him. Eventually, their work led to the Trinity test in 1945. This was followed by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, this was a success, right? Oppenheimer had done what he had set out to do. It was time to ride into the sunset and live a happy life. Except, not quite. Let's explore. Oppenheimer was born to a Jewish family in New York. His family was quite well off. His interests in chemistry and physics led to a major in Harvard. Robert was a clever man and he knew how to talk to people. However, he was quite clumsy and not good in the laboratory. He tried to join Ernest Rutherford at Cavendish Laboratory, but was ejected. He worked with J.J. Thomson at Cambridge instead. However, he was extremely unhappy at Cambridge. In one of the most well-known incidents of his illustrious life, Robert tried to poison his tutor Blackett with a poisoned apple. He was lucky not to be criminally charged. He left Cambridge to join Göttingen, which was a leading center of physics at the time. During this time of his life, he met some of the best physicists of that time, including Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, and Enrico Fermi. He worked as a professor in many institutions for a few years. He worked at Berkeley before the Manhattan Project. Here, he wrote a paper which had the basic properties of a celestial body we now know as the black hole. He also taught quantum physics. Oppenheimer was a very theoretical scientist. His arithmetic and calculations left a lot to be desired as compared to his peers, and he was famously bad in practical experiments. He worked with bright minds like Ernest Lawrence at Berkeley. This was his path to the Manhattan Project. Let's talk about that, shall we? Most people today remember Oppenheimer for this famous speech.
He knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
This was after the Trinity test. Oppenheimer was obviously happy after the test. However, as time passed, he became uneasy. He realized that no one should have the control over such power. He also realized that Truman would show no restraint in the use of the bomb. He was proven right a few days later as the little boy bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and the fat man was dropped on Nagasaki. This was followed by the immediate surrender of the Japanese and an Allied victory. The Americans celebrated and the troops came home. Oppenheimer's name became synonymous with the victory, making him the most celebrated physicist ever. He became world famous. To the contrary, the man himself was anything but happy. He imagined what the impact of a nuclear holocaust would be. He felt the blood on his hands. He felt that it was all his fault. The complex mix of feelings that Oppenheimer would have felt at this point is something that no human will ever experience again. His aforementioned meeting with Truman went poorly, but his conscience still haunted him. Over 200,000 dead in a matter of days, with many others affected adversely by the radiation. Views about Oppenheimer were divisive, to say the least. Many said he had done what he could do to stop the war, and the bomb was launched by Truman, not by him. Others said that the bomb itself was unnecessary and it was dropped on a defeated enemy. Robert's actions would have long-term effects that no one could fully anticipate until the bombing in Japan occurred. This disaster clearly broke Oppenheimer. You can see this in his famous interview. His eyes are hollow. His guilt is clear. He knows no apology would ever suffice. He never slept peacefully again. Nor was he allowed to live peacefully by the government of the United States. Oppenheimer was a controversial figure, but he never failed to speak his mind. He campaigned for the rest of his life for nuclear disarmament. This made him enemies in powerful places. His links and donations to communism were also worrying. He had associations and contacts with many known communists, and his wife previously held a party membership. He was watched carefully for the rest of his life. his security clearance was revoked and he was thrown out from his job in disgrace in an intentionally non-public affair. Even his loyalty to the country was questioned. He was seen as a risk of the leak of information to the Soviets with the Cold War in full swing. However, this didn't stop Oppenheimer from always speaking his mind completely freely. He used his platform to spread his message around the world till the day he died. He was a world famous celebrity after all. His personal life was also messy, with him constantly seeing two women, including Jean Tatlock and his wife, Kitty Oppenheimer. All this made him potentially the most misunderstood and controversial man in history. We come back to the topic of this video. Is J. Robert Oppenheimer the most important man to have ever lived? After all, Oppenheimer is a real-life Prometheus. In case you aren't familiar, Prometheus was the Greek titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to the humans. For this, he was chained to a rock and punished for all eternity. Oppenheimer was devastated following the events of the bombings. He tried for the rest of his life to right his wrongs. He campaigned against the hydrogen bomb and for the development of nuclear weapons. However, he was chasing a goal he simply could not accomplish. Once the race began, it could never be stopped. He had to live with his burden. This was his punishment. Like Prometheus, Robert was never able to come to terms with the bomb. His public insights were always contradictory in nature, which means today we can't get a clear understanding of what his thoughts were. But we can make a pretty damn good guess. Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer may be one of the most important movies ever to teach people about this man. His case study is extremely interesting. Cillian Murphy's portrayal of Oppenheimer was incredible. He captures the very essence of that character. He really gets where that character lives and thrives. The last scene of the movie is the perfect way to show what Oppenheimer felt. That look at the end gave me chills. You should definitely watch this movie. It's wonderful. We come back to the topic itself. He is definitely the most important human in history, but he is also a representation of a past mistake that must never be repeated again. We are much closer to nuclear warfare than we were 10 years ago. I leave you with this thought. All that stands between this reality and our destruction is the single press of a button.